Well, welcome everyone to this third session. Our topic will be through sound and silence. It's a wonderful blessing to be in the presence of serious people who know there's important work to be done, and it's up to us to do it. As you can tell from the profound papers and the deep discussions that the previous two panels presented, this is no ordinary time to be thinking about music, to be thinking about sound and society. As the great Percy Mayfield once wrote in a song, the world is in an uproar and the danger zone is everywhere. And it can be depressing to think that the depths, dimensions of hate, hurt, and fear that we see everywhere are deeply rooted in our past. And yet, as Philip Ewell said in the preceding session, there's probably never been a time in our lifetimes where people were standing up and speaking up and stepping up in response to these things and doing great work. And so we have three scholars, artists, activists presenting on sound and silence. SHANA Redmond will be talking about the sounds of no knocking. Ellen Waterman will be talking about reorienting audition through bodily listening in place. And Charles Eppley will be speaking on beyond objects, access artistry, and non-binary methods for a sound description. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to SHANA Redmond. It's always a delight to be in her presence, and I look forward to what you have to say, SHANA. We now have the pleasure of hearing from Ellen Waterman.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much. Thank you so much, SHANA, for that amazing meditation. So I'm going to share my screen here and dive right in with thanks to all the organizers and workers for this event. And although it's too minimal to say it like this, to acknowledge that I'm speaking on unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa. Sunlight streams through the window of my music room, spilling out across a low chest and onto the variegated maple floor. Sunlight plays across the dark, shiny grain of the old wooden chest, reflecting and shifting as I move. I slide the sunbeam across the surface of the chest by moving laterally. A blue and yellow Ghanaian batik runner threads the middle of the chest, interrupting the reflection, the colors intensifying in my sustained gaze. I stand sock-footed in the patch of sunlight on the floor. Warmth of light, chill of floor on my feet. I am holding my flute. First, I keep my eyes open and play long, low tones while focusing on the play of sunlight, the warmth and the feeling of toes and heels as I curl and lift and lower them while never losing contact with the floor. I am acutely aware of my flute, of how it feels in my hands under the pads of my fingers, stale, sour, metallic smell of old breath lingering in the head joint. I focus on my finger pressure on the keys. Inadvertently lifting my right middle finger causes a slight leak, a small squeak. I try to let sounds emerge as a byproduct of my interactions with the flute. Feet, light, and space. It's hard not to produce sounds consciously, but I am intent on trying to make music that decenters the sonic. Bodily listening in place is a proposition to explore environmental musicking beyond the confines of the auditory. The goal is to decenter and thus reorient audition through play with visual, kinetic, and haptic senses in place. If we understand listening as a metaphor for contact, attentiveness, and relationality, then the construct music expands beyond the auditory to encompass intersensory modes of environmental experience. Commissioned by New Adventures in Sound Art and funded by the Canada Council for the Arts, Bodily Listening in Place will be a score for improvisation by diverse bodies, hearing and non-hearing, seeing and non-seeing, by any means and any level of mobility. I've been developing this work in consultation with Spill Propagation, Artist Center for Creation, and production in sign language in Canada. I'm deeply indebted to deaf artist Tiffaine Giraud and hearing artist Paula Bath for engaging me in several weeks of creative exchanges. For example, I have recorded audio files of my improvisations that Tiffaine has listened to via a vibrotactile vest with embedded transducers. Here is Tiffaine's response to the piece Ellen for Tiffaine, which I'll let you read while I play a very short example. Tiffaine is wearing the Woojer vest when it's designed to enhance the visceral experience of video gaming. It's not that good at picking up the high registration and timbral minimalism of solo flute. So Paula also interpreted the piece for Tiffaine by moving her fingers on Tiffaine's back, providing what I think of as really an ethical model and beautiful model of listening interdependence. Tiffaine, in turn, produced a narrative drawing of her perceptions of the piece that I subsequently interpreted as a new graphic score. Through this series of interactions, plus conversations and writing, Paula and Tiffaine have helped me to expand my capacity to listen with my whole body. Two intersecting pathways are emerging through this research creation project. The first is reorienting the way I listen through an intentional focus on movement, touch, smell, sight, and to a lesser extent, taste. And the second is being mindful of creating scores and performance improvisations that are accessible to a wider range of bodies. This includes, for example, experimenting with a pitch-shifting guitar pedal and extended techniques to create a grainier, more bottomy timbre palette, more easily discernible by vibro-tactile media. On Monday, I'll begin a week-long residency with new adventures in sound art, during which I'll create a multimodal score for improvisation, including text, video, and audio with ASL and LSQ interpretation, and also record my own interpretation of the piece. The score will be made widely available, and participants will be invited to record their interpretations in the expressive form that is most meaningful to them. And we'll have a few gatherings and come together to share our interpretations as part of World Listening Day in July. So listening obviously holds a central place in music and sound studies, both as a process integral to musicking and sounding, and as a metaphor for certain kinds of attention. Pauline Oliveros' philosophy of deep listening is arguably a metaphor for empathy, producing good relations, while Dylan Robinson's concept of hungry listening is a metaphor for extraction, producing bad relations. Listening is often evoked as a bodily metaphor as well, in the advice to listen to your body and not overstrain sore muscles, or listen to your heart to make a good decision. In practice, however, for most of us, sound, music, and listening are unquestionably oriented to the sensory regime of audition, despite increasingly well-documented practices of haptic, kinetic, and visual musicking by musicians and sound artists such as Evelyn Glennie, Christine Sun Kim, and Pamela Witcher, and many conceptual links being drawn between deaf and sound studies. As Tomie Han reminds us, quote, "If we consider that we inhabit different sensory worlds, personally and culturally, then building awareness of the sensibilities someone else might be experiencing can expand our knowledge of self, other, and open communications." Indeed, intersensory experiments are hardly novel. Han has given us an excellent guide in her recent book, Arousing Sense: Recipes for Workshopping Sensory Experience. Similarly, choreographer and interspecies researcher Joanna Mendel-Shaw offers a theory of physical listening that situates hearing and seeing in relation to spatial awareness, weight sensing, and tactile experience. And I would point you to the excellent guide in the program for this conference, which also offers similar resources. Developing a sustained intersensory practice as a musician, however, is proving quite a challenge for me. It is altering my listening habitus, throwing me off balance, literally leaving me in suspense. What I'm calling bodily listening in place requires something akin to what Natasha Myers and Joe Dumit have called improvising in a state of mid-embodiment. Writing about the intraactive practices and responsive bodies of scientists engaging with experimental media and communicating their findings through narrative and embodied gesture, Myers and Dumit observed that new insights and forms of dexterity are acquired in the process. Their concept of the responsive excitability of bodies is used to, quote, account for how it is that experimentalists acquire new kinesthetic, affective, and conceptual dexterities as they engage in the process of learning to see, feel, and know. And I would add, listen, in the expansive way I am defining it here. But an important caution is that Myers and Dumit's work, like most academic work, is implicitly ableist. It assumes a seeing, hearing, mobile subject. So in taking any of these ideas on board, we have to correct that bias. Further, we need to account for the complexities of working across deaf and hearing music cultures. What I'm attracted to is precisely what can be learned in this reciprocal intercultural encounter. For example, my work with spill propagation has made me attuned to vibrations, seen and felt, with an intensity that I've never experienced in 5 decades of making music in all kinds of environments. When I listen to music through the vibrotactile vest, I only discern a generalized buzzing and rhythmic thumping. My haptic sense, it seems, is totally underdeveloped. So what does it mean to acquire dexterity in a sensory mode? Or better, what does it mean to adopt an intersensory approach to listening that encompasses multiple possible sensory modes? And what happens when we foreground interdependence as a valid and precious ground for listening? These questions animate my desire to reorient audition through bodily listening in place. Following Myers and Dumit, I situate this intersensory practice as, quote, hovering in a space of knowing mid-embodiment, and I concur that this is the space in which improvisation and creativity flourish. I pick up the flute once more, spend some time just touching it, feeling it touch me, smelling that rancid smell, rolling the patterned edge of the little cap that seals the head joint across my cheek. It is so intimate that I am suddenly self-conscious. A feeling that this might be too gimmicky intrudes on the experience. I close my eyes and see a glowing, luminous cloud of yellow. I play this cloud, which turns pink and purple as I turn my body in space. The resulting music is just a 3-note repeated motif, but it shifts in intensity and timbre along with the play of color behind my eyes. It feels lovely. Thank you.
Lovely indeed. And for those of us who've spent most of our careers trying to center the sonic, Ellen inviting us to think of all that we gain by decentering it, all that opens up, and all that enables us to question the artificial, arbitrary, irrational, unnecessary attachments that we've been lulled into. So thank you so much for that, Ellen, and it builds brilliantly on SHANA's provocation, and we now have the pleasure and honor to hear from Charles Eppley talking about Beyond Objects, Access Artistry, and Non-Binary Methods for Sound Description. So turn it to you, Charles.
Hi, thank you. Can everyone see my presentation and hear my voice? I think so. Thank you. So yeah, for time's sake, I'll just jump into this because I know we're approaching the break point. But this is Beyond Objects, Non-Binary Methods in Sound Description. I'm Charles Eppley. I use they, he pronouns, and I'm currently visiting assistant professor of media studies and art history at UC Riverside. So according to the 2021 NEA report, sorry, let me minimize this. 2021 NEA report, 61% of arts institutions experienced a large negative impact amidst the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Art museums, theaters, and concert halls have invested in digital programming with unprecedented volume since 2020, in order to make up for their rapidly declining visitor rates. 72% of performing arts venues moved their in-person events to virtual platforms in some capacity, and 47 organizations moved their programs 100% online. Yet while there are more virtual programs available to audiences than ever before, arts institutions, regardless of discipline or funding, still struggle to cultivate accessible programs for disabled people. In fact, sometimes remote programs digitally reinforce physical and social barriers that exclude disabled people from arts venues in real life, IRL. So this presentation conveys my experience working as a sound describer in the Remote Access Project, a disability arts collective and CRIP nightlife program, first formed in the first months of the pandemic. Housed in the Critical Design Lab at Vanderbilt University, Remote Access creates online disability arts and culture events, workshops, artist projects, musical performances, karaoke, DJ sets, etc. In this community of disabled artists, I've developed unconventional methods and theories of sound description, a textual accessibility practice that describes sonic phenomena to deaf and hard of hearing people. This particular case study overviews my approach to the topic and connects to broader questions on how we perceive and understand sound, interpersonal sensory experience, and how binary thinking limits our interpretation of sound and reinforces inequities in music scholarship and listening culture. Some institutions are experienced in digital programming, but most are engaging remote audiences for the first time. This lack of knowledge can produce alienating experiences for disabled people. For example, remote events will often use Zoom's auto caption feature alone to provide access to deaf and hard of hearing attendees. Automatic speech recognition, or ASR, algorithms often misinterpret spoken language, providing incorrect information based on machine learning systems that are limited or overtly biased. They are also often designed to ignore nonverbal acoustical information, such as music or soundscape. Description of sensory information, whether acoustical or visual, is a crucial part of web access. Rather than relying on automated services like ASR, a robust access model will commission live humans to respond to sensory information as it occurs and render or compress that thick experience, to quote Nina's work, into an easily digestible, readable, and listenable description. Conventionally, the description should be delivered as neutrally as possible without interference or interpretation. In this process, the describer makes quick decisions about what and how to describe. In other words, they have to identify the most relevant aspects of sonic phenomena and choose how to convey those in a straightforward way. The process is fraught, as the describer is asked to occupy an objective position that's impossible to uphold, creating lingering tension between analytical and intuitive perception. And there are numerous types of description. However, the most common are image description and audio description, which are both designed as points of access for blind or low-sighted individuals. And to paraphrase them here, image description is based on the textual description of images, of films, websites, digital animations, etc., paintings in museums or sculptures. Alternative text is a subset of image description that is more concise and brief and is attached as metadata to digital images and used by screen readers that synthesize it into synthesized speech, audible synthesized speech, or convert it into tactile braille. And then there's audio description, which provides as well these concise descriptions of visual content, but rather than being written, audio description is verbally conveyed through speech, and often you see that in live performance settings, such as in concert halls or in theaters. Now enter sound description. As a sound describer, your role is to describe acoustical information rather than images. Sound description is not musical analysis, but it often imbues musical content. It approaches music as but one aspect of a larger sonic situation or environment. Relying too heavily on esoteric musical analysis or reductive musical rhetoric is ineffective. For example, in sound captions on TV shows, you're likely to encounter vague descriptions like rock music playing or intense electronic music or simply electronic sound. What sounds encompass genres such as rock or electronic music? What makes a sound eerie or intense? How do you describe a sound, a piece of music or otherwise, in a way that is both informative and compelling? Is it at all possible to compress this thick event of sound into a textual description and still retain intuitive and emotional resonance? Can sound description provide connection between people rather than a top-down packaging of knowledge that prioritizes the experience of hearing people? And here is an example of sound description from Bojana Kokliat, who with Shannon Finnegan, two disabled artists, created a workbook called Alt Text as Poetry. And I've analyzed this in yellow, conveying the literalist kind of analytical description of sound. And then in pink is the more metaphorical or intuitive description. And I'll play a little bit of this right now while you read.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that case, you can see that Bojana is describing some of the literal sounds that are being heard, but then ends it with this kind of intuitive suggestion that translates or transposes it into a tactile and emotional representation, of the lovely breeze brushing against your skin on a warm day, expanding the sonic into other types of metaphorical sensory experience. So description practices often presume a strict division between object and subject. The perceiving subject is supposed to be able to, and should attempt to, describe external objects, including sound or music, with complete objectivity. Informed by intersectional approaches to and social values embodied by remote access, I suggest that this is impossible, and that the attempt to naturalize objectivity reinforces ableist, gendered, and racialized binary thinking that undermines access. Drawing from queer and trans theory, sound studies, and disability studies, I propose there are effective non-binary methods and theories for sound description that resolve tensions between analytical and intuitive perception and leverage the messiness of subjectivity through values of interdependence and mutual care. In this feeling, I want to think through sound description within the emerging field of non-binary studies. I want to ask, is there a non-binary theory? And if so, is there a method? How might this framework impact the practice of sound description, which is concerned with mediating the binary relationships between objects and subjects, as well as the nuanced interplays of marginalized persons and identities? Building off of the work of non-binary scholars and theorists like San-C Chang, Eliza Steinbach, and Marquise Bey, there are several ideas to me that contribute to a general frame for conceiving of a non-binary theory and method for sound description and general sort of interpretation of the phenomenological environment. First, non-binary embodiment poses an immanent subjective presence, resisting discrete quantification by fixed gender norms and categories. As the non-binary author San-C Chang says, quote, "Non-binary predates binary. Those of us who don't fit the expectations for what is masculine or feminine have existed across almost every continent going back centuries. But one of the impacts of colonization is that histories are forgotten not by accident." And they continue to say, quote, "They are violently muffled until they don't make a sound," end quote. Second, the plural singular they pronoun reflects a strategy of openness to gender that cultivates multifaceted and ever-evolving forms of being and knowing. Bey also writes on how the singular plural they, as a marker of expansive gender, is intimate with a notion of Blackness, end quote, through how this word also manifests in Black vernacular speech in the US. Connecting the they of these two domains, Bey reveals how both share, quote, "a certain kind of openness to subjectivity," end quote, and explain further, quote, "The outsidedness to recognizability is indexical of a type of subjectivity not currently known, an identity on some shit the likes of which we ain't never seen." In access work, describers are meant to distance themselves completely. In other words, you uphold a binary relationship between subject and object. However, a critical understanding of image or sound description through disability studies and non-binary studies recognizes that there are no neutral or objective positions from which to perceive, and that there is not clear distinction between subject and object. In search of a subjectless position, the describer may be more likely, in actuality, to unconsciously wield power over people following their description, the people for whom they're describing, in other words. Forced distance between the subject and object produces a false belief that one is in fact being objective, and that one is merely describing what they perceive. Sound as it is, but sounds never are as they are. So how might non-binary thinking help us to engage with objects of our perception more holistically and creatively? How might we create a new model of interpersonal listening and subjective description? Can metaphor and simile aid this process? And so here are a couple of examples of my work, and I can be kind of quick here because I know we're limited on time. But again, in yellow, you can see how I have analyzed my own sound description writing for a project, a multidisciplinary or multi-sensory project at Tangled Art and Disability in Toronto. And you can read these on your own, but you can see how generally I begin with a somewhat literalist or analytical description of the sounds being made, using some musical language, which is to say language from music theory, which I do have experience in, but making that more rhetorically accessible, not using too much jargon. And then I like to also follow that up with a subjective, kind of intuitive description of how the sounds convey multi-sensory experiences beyond purely acoustic experiences, including emotional resonances. For example, in the third option, you can read the description of loud electronic squelching begin. Distorted digitally, they overwhelm the sound with an atonal arpeggio. They seem computerized and randomized, contrasting the softer gestural subtleties of the previous rhythmic interplay. Okay, fairly analytical, but then I follow it up with the music confuses the brain, providing a psychoacoustic irritation that approximates a buzzing mosquito encircling your head. And I should say my head in that case. And here are some other examples that I like, summoning the image of dried beans being tossed around inside of a paper envelope to convey this kind of frenetic handshaker, as well as a large bubble being repeatedly blown and popped, or the sound of television static or evening rain, which has clear visual imagery, or the kind of physical tactile sensations of a cassette tape melting in a sunny window. Some other examples of my work is, in remote access, there's a lot of DJ work, a lot of DJ mixing. And so that can be a challenging process to describe sound of a live DJ mix, because DJs, improvise like any other musician. And so, especially conveying the energy of club music can be somewhat challenging. But I have 3 clips I can briefly show you of the type of language.
We're running late on time.
Okay, well then I can stop here. But what you can see here is that in my practice, instead of embodying dominant values of description practice that exist as they do currently, in which pure neutrality and objectivity is desired, a non-binary and access artistry-oriented perspective of sound description points toward a multi-sensory and subjective model that blurs the phenomenological and epistemological boundaries of subject and object, and cultivates interpersonal and interpretive experience built on the foundational values of disability community. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And thanks to everyone. All the panelists have given us important things to think about. These presentations demand us to contemplate who we are, what we are, what's our relationship to each other, what's our relationship to the world that makes us and the world that we make. In keeping with that, we have a few minutes for discussion. As we've done for each of these sessions, we want to remind you that as we improvise together and have a conversation, we want to be open, honest, and mutually supportive. We want to approach one another with respect and kindness, and we want to make sure everyone is able to participate. So if you have a question or comment, if you're able to, please put it in the chat. If you would like to signal with your hand, I will try to get that as well, although I don't always have access to all of the visuals here, but I'll do the best I can. So first, let me ask, do the panelists have comments or questions for each other?
I see that Tikla Babiak has her hand up, George.
Oh, okay. Tikla, please make your statement or question.
Yeah, thank you for this really amazing panel. My question is for Charles. There's a kind of interesting ambiguity I noticed in these descriptions as to when you say you, like a breeze brushing against your skin, or when you say my, like I think you corrected it to a mosquito buzzing around my head, and somewhere else it said one's head. So I was just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how to kind of choose that pronoun and how that choice might shape the description. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And, you know, I do straightforward kind of description access work as well. So I'll clarify that the work that I do in remote access is in the context of a group of disabled people and artists kind of experimenting with forms of access, right? And so I would say that in general practice, when describing, there is, you know, it is important to try to be somewhat neutral, or as neutral as possible, so that you're not overpowering the interpretation of, you know, the blind or the deaf, you know, recipient of that information, so they can make their own decisions. And so when using terms, like when inserting this kind of subjective response, I would say, yeah, you need to be somewhat careful about it and be aware of who you're speaking with. If you're doing description in a professional capacity, you know, at a ballet, to you know, describing it to a blind attendee, or describing sound to a deaf person in a museum, you might want to be more neutral in your use of language and avoid using maybe some subjective, you know, description at all, depending on what they want. You know, if they're open to it, then great. Some people want completely neutral, right? And so, you know, generally, even with the subjective angle, I would say that one should always try to be mindful of themselves, right? And so the feeling of the mosquito buzzing around my head, right? That's me saying that that's my experience of this sensation, and you can kind of take that and approximate that, but I don't want to say you, because then that's kind of top down saying that, you know, this is your experience, you know, and it kind of limits the interpretation.
We have a comment from Michelle Kisliuk saying neutral is never neutral either. Michelle, you want to elaborate on that?
Oh, thanks. No, I was just interjecting, but maybe Charles has something to say about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, the entirety of this presentation is about this idea that that accessibility initiatives at this moment, when institutions are doing more remote programming and using things like captioning and ASL interpretation and description practices, you know, there's a moment where access is being more supported, you know, than it used to be. And I'm glad to see the use of captioning in various forms on this event. But one of the issues there is that we can have this false confidence in objectivity and in neutrality, to the degree where people can believe, you know, that they're describing neutrally, and it's not really accounting for their own positionality or whatever biases they might be bringing with that. And so I would love to have, you know, a deeper understanding, right, of that connection of the subject to the object, the fact that we can't have this separation between them, that we have to account for ourselves and our positionality, especially in terms of access. And I think that this is something that comes up through a number of the other papers on this panel, and then throughout the conference thus far, and continuing as well. And so definitely neutrality doesn't exist. And I find the disability arts context of remote access really fulfilling experience of description that accounts for that.
So I would like to make sure that Ellen and SHANA get questions as well. I have a question to pose to both of you. Your papers think of expressive culture in a broader frame. That Shana, the history of the Panthers, the voice of Nina Simone, the use of music for no knock, and your demand to us to listen, to see, to hear, to participate in this it goes beyond what we've been told art is. It goes beyond what history and politics are. It seems to have a different role for expressive culture than we've been taught. And similarly, Ellen, you know, by taking the sonic, or at least marginalizing the sonic in music making, it seems as if everything is up for grabs. Nobody knows what comes next, and we have to rethink really important ways that we've been taught to think about these things. And so I wonder if the two of you can speak about your engagement with the categories we've been given and your effort to and successful efforts to overcome them.
Go ahead, Shana.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question, of course, George, and thank you for it, because this is really something that I think is kind of framing so much of the work that I see myself doing, right, is understanding how musical practice, how rehearsal, how Black collectivities of various forms that are always already sonic have actually undercut and radically refused the state, right? The violences of the state in particular, but also all of its kind of rhetorical and discursive practices. So I think the work of this project as it's taking shape is continuing in that work to some substantial degree, but is really trying to retool us for how we understand Blackness if and when we hear it or see it, right? It's to say actually that it's in the mundane moments of Hampton listening to the album starring Nina Simone that we actually know far more about who this person was in the world than what the state's archive or, the kind of radical historiography has demonstrated to us, and that there's value in that knowing, that there's value in that kind of hearing. But also that we have to rethink the kinds of ways that we prepare for continuing futures of ambush, right? And I think part of what I've derived from hearing my work in relationship to the other papers is some kind of, wish and hopefully some energy towards thinking through how do we prepare and strategize around silence? Are there other affective models, other kinds of abilities that we might start to prepare ourselves for that actually put us in a better position to defend ourselves for in the wake of the kinds of violences that we continue to see being meted out with increasing rapidity, right? That there are other ways of protecting ourselves against the silence of the state. And so I want to thank you both, Charles and Ellen, for having delivered these papers, because it's helping me to think in more creative ways about how to make this work practically significant for people, which has always been an aim and goal for me as a scholar.
Yeah. And for me, like this tiny little practice that I'm doing, right, is in some way, it's a response to a fair while now of doing projects with people with disabilities, with folks in deaf culture, especially starting to work with signed music, musicians who in deaf culture who make no sound at all as part of the music. And it's a proposition to say, wait a minute, rethink entirely what you think music is. But that in itself is exactly as you're saying, Shana. It's really a call to rethink all our verities, to rethink the things that we think we already know so deeply in our skin, in our bodies, that we don't need to question them in any way. Questioning listening for me, coming out of work with Murray Schafer and Pauline Oliveros, and all this listening has been at the absolute kind of core thing, right? And it turns out that I'm not a very good listener at all. There's all kinds of facets of listening that I just, my body doesn't do. And that someone like Tifane's body absolutely does. So for me, this is also a practice of, you called it preparation, Shana, but for me, I think it's also a practice of just relearning how to be in a world of crisis, where we're not very good, in fact, at listening to one another.
Well, your work and your papers show us that we're at a crossroads. We're at an important moment in history. The boat is rocking, the table is shaking, and what we do matters a lot. The great Cesar Chavez used to say, the rich have money, but the poor have time. And so we use our time to try to put our shoulder to the wheel and to try to imbue the world with the potential to make right things come to pass. And I want to thank the presenters for making that possible. Chavez says the rich have money, the poor have time. We're so poor, we're even out of time. And I was told long ago, don't stand in the way of a group of scholars and their lunch. And so we're going to have to sadly end this session, but I'm sure Charles and Ellen and SHANA will be happy to hear from you, and you'll be hearing from them and the important work that they do in the future. So thanks to everyone for this wonderful session, and we'll see what we'll take from it. The great Willie Ricks, who changed his name to Mukasa Data, was an activist with SNCC, and he said, if we stay on the path, we'll see each other down the road. And so this is an end of a session, but it's the beginning of a journey where we're going to see each other down the road. And I think we'll all look forward to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
George.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.